would you be able to start by telling my viewers a bit about yourself and a summary of the work you do?
Sure. So my name's Rothna Begum, and I'm the Women's Rights Researcher on the Middle East and North Africa. And what that means is that at Human Rights Watch, I cover all women's rights issues in the region. I sometimes focus on very specific projects. So I happen to have two themes of work that I'm working on specifically, which is migrant domestic workers as well as domestic violence. So those are the two
Okay.
key themes that I'm working on. But beyond that, I tend to do other pieces of work.
Okay, thank you. What made you become a women's rights researcher?
For me, women's rights is fundamental to human rights in general. So this is an issue that's always been a big passion of mine. So when the job came along, I snatched it up very much.
Okay, and would you be able to tell me about the work you've done with migrants specifically, if that's okay?
Sure. So I've been working on migrant workers' rights for several years now, and just specifically for the last 2 years, I've been doing work on migrant domestic workers,
Okay,
primarily in the Gulf states, so places like Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, as well as for previous work on Saudi Arabia.
okay,
Now, migrant domestic workers, there are about two
cool.
within the GCC states, the Gulf Cooperation Council states, and so they are a high proportion of domestic workers within these countries, and there's a high demand for them by families there. But the work that we've done is sort of suggests that they are incredibly vulnerable to abuse and exploitation, largely because within these states they institute what's known as the kafala system. This is the visa sponsorship system that ties domestic workers to their employers and prevents them from leaving them to work for another employer or to leave the country altogether.
Okay,
And what that does is traps them into very abusive situations, and they're literally locked into homes, working 7 days a week, very, very long hours, and sometimes are even subject to physical or even sexual abuse. So given that the systems in this place, the laws and the regulations, are designed in a way that actually facilitates forced labor, what some people call modern day slavery, we consider that to be a priority for our division and our organization, and have since taken it upon ourselves to conduct both research and advocacy to end this abuse.
okay, thank you. Through your research and the work you've done, what are the rights or the lack of rights that women refugees have?
So, women, when they become refugees, are in a population that is considered to be much more vulnerable. Often they form quite a large majority of those refugees, depending on the context, of course, and they're vulnerable to all sorts of abuse and exploitation. So, for instance, in Lebanon, women refugees sometimes are heads of households because their husbands are not with them, or they've died, or they were single women, and so on. And once they become heads of households, they're in a position where they are required to ensure that they are able to provide for their families, their young children, and so on. But in Lebanon, many of them were experiencing issues such as harassment, exploitation. So, for instance, their landlords were, increasing rent or asking for sexual favors. They're around the workplace because they're much more vulnerable as refugees because they need that financial sustenance. They end up being much more vulnerable to other forms of abuse and exploitation.
Okay, would you personally say that women need to be prioritised to go into safe places when they become refugees, women and children? Is it important for both of them to be prioritised?
I think there's a general acceptance that there needs to be measures taken, especially for women and children. Now, there are a range of issues you need to think about when women become refugees, and it depends on it's the place settings as well. So, for instance, if they're living in camps, you need to think about sanitation and hygiene. You need to think about where women are their toilets, for instance, are the toilets separate? So if women need to be able to go to the bathroom, can they do so feeling safe and not feeling like they might be subject to sexual abuse or harassment? So there are situations where women wouldn't go to the toilets, for instance, because the likelihood of being raped or abused in other ways, and also ensuring that the camp setting is in such that women are not prohibited from moving around as well, because sometimes families also try to keep control in order to sort of, quote unquote, protect them as well. So there needs to be ways of ensuring that there's adequate protection for women, but also to ensure that there's enough measures in place for both them and children.
Okay, thank you. What do you think should be done? Like, what further actions do you believe should be done to help women refugees?
In general,
And yeah, so what do you think that, specifically the EU, what do you think they should do to help women refugees? Because obviously recently there has been a rise in refugees with Syria and other countries. Do you feel the EU are doing enough, and do you believe they should be doing more? If so, what?
so depending on the country in question, they need to take into account the gender aspects of what's happening in these displaced settings. So,
Okay.
for instance, where there are camps and areas where they're residing, they need to think through how that impacts on women and girls, including, as I was explaining, things like sanitation and hygiene. So women obviously have menstrual hygiene to think about. That is an issue that you need to take into account as a gender issue. You also need to take into account their safety, their ability to be able to move around the camp, their ability to be able to access hygiene toilets and so on. But also, further than that, they need to ensure that if they are providing food vouchers, or any kind of help, that it's not just going to the men, but it's also going to the women.
Yeah.
So ensuring that there's adequate access, equal access to these kind of measures and protections that we in place.
Okay, has it been displayed that there aren't those equal measures between men and women refugees then?
I think there's been some reports that found that in some contexts there were mixed toilets, for instance, where Syrian women found it difficult to access those toilets because they were worried about being unsafe in those times, so they actually didn't go to use those bathrooms. They have, in some contexts, they've actually got a vast communal space where it's all mixed, in which case that means women and men are all over the place, and that can be quite also a little bit dangerous. So you need to think a little bit. They need to think a little bit through more about what the gender issues are, and sometimes that means having a gender officer on hand in these various different contexts and countries. And so wherever there's a displaced population of people who are, seeking protection, they need to be ensuring that there is somebody there thinking through these measures and ensuring that there's adequate protection in place.
Lastly, with the work you've done, have you found there's been a difference between the help provided for women who have children and, say, women that don't have children and are unmarried? Has there been a difference in the help provided? So is there more help for women who are pregnant or have children than for those who don't?
We haven't done enough research to be able to validate one way or the other.
Okay.
But there are certain things that you need to take into consideration when women are pregnant, because they are vulnerable. They do require certain measures, specifically for their own health. So ensuring that they have access to medical care, that they are sleeping in good conditions, and that there is adequate food and nutrition for them as well. These are all things that need to be taken into account for pregnant women and for women who have very young children, so children who are still being breastfed. So these are vulnerable categories of women who do need special care, and that is part of international human rights standards where there needs to be specific attention provided.
Okay. Do you feel like that help is being provided to the extent it should be for those women who are breastfeeding or who are pregnant?
So there is a mixed response. In some cases, they have taken that into account. In other contexts, there's not enough. And that's partly because the sheer numbers of different places and where the authorities are only just trying to understand how to deal with it. But in those contexts, they need to immediately be considering the gender component and taking priority over those who are the most vulnerable.
Okay, and would you say women are more vulnerable than men?
They are not vulnerable inherently.
Okay.
But they do require specific measures at certain points. So understanding the fact that women are more likely to be subject to sexual harassment and abuse, or fear that, which means that there needs to be measures in place to ensure that women can access certain things. Okay. Then there's the fact that certain women, like pregnant women or women with children at a very, very young age, they in that context, require certain healthcare, certain measures for themselves. And that does not mean that they are inherently vulnerable, but because they are not at the same level as other women or other men, they do need special measures.
Okay, I think that's about it. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.